Oh, gosh, that's loud. Good morning, everybody. My name's Sandy Kerr, and I'm a professor of marine governance at Heriot-Watt University, but you're not here to listen to me. I'm here to give the introduction to our talk today. And the title of our talk is The Council, the Parliament, and the Black Oil. And I've seen a little sneak preview of this, and it's a tale of, oil coming to Orkney and Shetland, but it's a tale of people, power, and politics. And our speaker today, Dr. Tim Noble, has been a friend and colleague of mine for a great many years, but Tim's had an interesting and varied career. He started his working career as a civil engineer, which saw him in Dubai, it saw him in Orkney, and it saw him in Shetland as he followed oil around the world. He then retrained, did a master's at Heriot-Watt University and a PhD as well. Then worked in VSO in Vanuatu in Philippines, if I remember rightly, before coming back to Orkney, back to Heriot-Watt University, and having a career as an academic, finishing his career as a lecturer at Heriot-Watt University. As I said, I've had a sneak preview of the presentation, and it's absolutely fascinating, and I know you're going to really enjoy this. It's also partly a personal account, but it's also tells the tale of oil from the perspective of the characters that are involved and the politics that underlies it. If you're not from Orkney, you're probably vaguely aware that oil came here sometime in the 1970s, and a lot of this will be new. Even if you are from Orkney and Shetland and you think you know a lot about oil coming to Orkney and Shetland, I can guarantee there'll be some new things in here for you. And I certainly learned a lot. We're going to have questions at the end, and here we've got the Slido for those of you that want to put your questions in online, but we can do that in the sort of conventional way with hands up, and there's a microphone as well. And I'm hoping for some really good questions here, because this isn't just a tale about 50 years ago. It's highly relevant to today. We went through an energy transition 50 years ago that brought oil here. We're looking at a future that's going to bring offshore wind in a large way to the waters round about us and Scapa Flow again. I'd like you to reflect on that when you listen to this excellent presentation. So, just a little bit of housekeeping. I have to say there are no planned fire drills. So if the fire alarm goes out, there's 2 fire exits at the back, 2 at the front. We can vacate this place very quickly. As I said, Slido, use the QR code if you want to put questions in online, and we'll pick them up, or it's hands up at the end. And finally, can you please turn the sound off in your mobile? I bet somebody's forgotten to do it in here. Double check, turn the sound off. So I think that's all I've got to say, but our speaker, Dr. Tim Noble, is going to count up to now. Thank
you. Thank you very much indeed. And wow, quite an audience. I'll put it amongst my greatest hits. I'm always scared with these things that you come to do this and no one turns up. It's just one man and his dog in the back row, and the dog gets up and leaves. Anyway, it's really nice to be here. Thank you for coming. First of all, could I just ask for a show of hands of anyone who was here in the 1970s? Quite a few. Quite a few. And is there anyone here today from Shetland? Fantastic. Because this is equally an Orkney and a Shetland story. In fact, in some respects, it's more Shetland than it is Orkney, but we'll come to that. The plan today is to tell a story. But the theme is really devolution of powers coming to the local community to deal with very significant change. So it starts off as a bit of a personal story. Maria here will recognize that as Sombra and the approach to Sombra. It is almost 50 years ago to the day that my family and I arrived. My wife and then 2 young daughters arrived in Shetland on transfer from Dubai. I was reposted at short notice to come to Shetland, where my company, which was then Costain, had won a few contracts that was going to keep us here for a bit. And we arrived on one of those beautiful Vickers Viscounts, which, for those of you who remember them, with the big oval windows and real comfort, and an airline that looked after you. Our house wasn't ready when we arrived in Shetland, and initially we were put up here at the Sombra Hotel, which then was, they wouldn't mind me saying, a little bit run down. It's not now, it's quite posh, a bit too posh for my liking, but then it was a bit run down, and we were put up here. And my wife wrote to her parents saying, we're installed in Colditz. And we were here for 2-3 weeks until our house was ready. But the thing that fascinated me about this place, and we'd come, by the way, we'd driven through Iran on the way home from Dubai. And 2 weeks before this, we were staying in probably the most luxurious hotel in the world in Esfahan, the Shah Abbas Hotel, which we treated ourselves to. And then we ended up at Sombra. But I preferred the Sombra. And it was fascinating. It gave me an indication of what we were going to face here. The place was heaving, absolutely full to overflowing, with rig workers, construction workers, consultants, managers, helicopter pilots, air crew. It was packed out. And the bars were still running well into the early morning, including the helicopter pilots. They were flying at 7 o'clock, but they have different standards now, I think. So what was the background to all this? Well, the 1970s background. The 1970s tends to get a fairly bad name these days. Everyone talks about, we'll keep going back to the 70s. It was actually a very productive decade. It was turbulent. A lot of things were going wrong. But at the same time, there was a lot of things happening. And for my particular industry as a construction engineer, it was boom time in construction. And we did fine. And then the oil came along. The country was energy desperate. I love this book. I don't know if you know the book Prize by Daniel Jurgen, which is a story of the oil industry through the 20th century. And it really is a history of the 20th century. Power and politics globally working through what oil was available and what the price was. And what had happened in the 1970s for this country, the miners' strikes were on. So our coal-fired power stations were not producing enough. And the 1973 Middle East War, which resulted in the Arab oil embargoes, and the price was shooting up. So the whole country was desperate for energy, and oil was seen then as the solution. This was it. We had our own oil. And we could take ourselves out of some of the problems of finding energy. That's just very briefly an indication of what happened at the beginning of the 70s on price. It suddenly spiked. It had been crawling along at $3 a barrel for decades. And then in the early 70s, with these problems, and particularly the Middle East countries asserting themselves with OPEC, we saw the price shoot up, which caused problems, severe problems for the West. So the drive was on to, the fact we'd found oil in the North Sea was extraordinary. Even the government didn't believe it for a time. The maps on the right are some of the early maps of the fields, the northern fields in the East Shetland Basin, things like Brent and Ninian, Magnus, and southern fields, including Piper and Claymore, which eventually came in here, and Forties, the big one was Forties. And there was a lovely documentary on BBC just a couple of weeks ago, which repeated an earlier documentary about Nig Bay, where these massive rigs, the technology, the change in technology, This was working at the absolute limit for the oil companies in getting oil from waters which were so deep and so turbulent. So they were the rigs of Nig, and the documentary tells the story of the village of Nig and the way the companies worked to train up local people to build these massive rigs, including importing people from the shipyards around Glasgow. I want to just look at two projects, two of the projects we did. They're two of the larger ones. The first one, Sunbury Airport. Well, okay, it's a story about oil. Why choose the airport? I chose this because it really was the hub of what was happening in the North Sea. This is where the point where everyone came together. The rig workers, the construction workers, the managers, the general public. You had access to all this that was going on. Whereas a lot of the rest of the stuff was behind fences and you never met. But at Sunbury, the expansion was huge. And this was one of our big contracts. We rebuilt the whole of Sunbury Airport, everything you see there, pretty much. But going from a point where in 1970, I think there were 2,000 ATMs, air traffic movements, and 30,000 passengers. By 1978, there were 700,000 passengers and 51,000 air traffic movements. And it was, again, just like the Sunbury Hotel, one of the exciting places in the world. There were streams of old fixed-wing planes coming in from Aberdeen and people being transferred to helicopters to go out to the rigs. So old planes like wartime DC-3s were put into service, carrying freight, and charters bringing the oil workers in and then getting them out to the rigs. In the late 70s, there were 30 helicopters based here, and the airport was working pretty much day and night. So that was the hub, the North Sea hub. The other project, here we are in Orkney, be familiar to you as Flotta, the Flotta Oil Terminal. Our part in Flotta was not a small one, it was big to us. We built the crude tanker jetty, which you can see in the top left-hand corner. And you can just about see the jacket platform, which we used to complete that. It was a funny contract because the client were really wanted to keep us apart from the onshore people. A lot of the trades who were working onshore Flotta were mechanical electrical trades who tended to be a little bit more militant than our civil engineering workforce. And so they put our workforce on Hoy. Mm-hmm. So we set up a base on Hoy and a labour camp on Hoy. And we had a little ferry where we bring people in from Rinnigal Pier, for those of you who know that part of Hoy. And they tried to keep us separate with just a very small onshore presence in Flotta itself. So those were two of our jobs. Then I just want to talk about three people in particular, three personalities from that time. The first is Ian R. Clark, who was one time treasurer for Zetland County Council, became chief executive of Shetland Islands Council at a very young age. He sadly died in June. I was hoping to have contact with him this year, but he passed away fairly recently. Ian was he was the driver. He was a young man, and he was the first person who really noticed what it meant for the oil companies to come to the islands, that it meant a major change, and that the islands needed some control, some protection from the companies riding roughshod over everything that the islanders held dear. So he was only 33 in 1972, when he drafted the first provisional order, which would give the Shetland Council the right to control some aspects of the oil company's work in Shetland. He then became chief exec of Shetland Islands Council when it was formed 74, 75. But he was always the driver behind it. And the oil companies didn't like him. Well, they said they didn't like him. Some people would say that they just wanted to hold up someone on the other side as the enemy. And they held up Ian Clark. And Ian was described by the US consul in Edinburgh as a tyrant and a hornswoggler. And this is someone who bamboozles people, swindles people, who was swindling these American companies out of their right to bring oil into the islands. But he held his ground, and he subsequently went on to become a director of the British National Oil Corporation. But when that folded, I worked with him for a bit within Costain. And then he followed his life's love of theology, and he went away and did a PhD in theology. And sadly passed away this year, but a very important character in what happened here with the subsequent acts, the Zetland County Council Act and the Orkney Islands Council Act, which allowed the councils to control some of the oil operations. The second I want to draw attention to is dear, lovely Joe Grimond. It's very difficult to find anyone who has a bad word to say about him. I dare say there might be some people somewhere, but he was clearly loved across the islands and across the spectrum in Westminster. He was Orkney and Shetland MP for a long time and leader of the Liberal Party. And he led the parliamentary case for the Orkney County Council Act and the Zetland County Council Act, which gave this protection. I'll come to his speeches in a moment. But his second reading speech of April 1973 is worth reading if you have time. You can find it on Hansard, and it's a gem of a speech in putting this case forward for the islands to be protected and have some control. There was a time of big change for the islands. There were other things going on. The two island councils had only just been formed, and 1974-75, so that was going on in the background. And the original plan had been for the islands to join Highland and to be governed from Inverness. And Joe Grimond, amongst others, was able to scotch that proposal. And then the three big island councils, Western Islands Council, Orkney Islands Council, and Shetland Islands Council, were formed from the old county councils and the town councils. And then when we came to 1978, there was the first Scottish devolution referendum. And Joe Grimond won an amendment to the Scotland Act, which would actually have allowed, if the vote had gone in favour, well, it did go in favour, but it didn't reach the required majority. It had to be a supermajority. If the act had gone in, if the vote had gone in favour, then his amendment, which was passed, allowed Orkney and Shetland to opt out of the Scottish Parliament and to remain with Westminster. I don't know how that would have worked. It sounds incredibly complicated, but that was there as an option. And even then, there was a lot of talk about different models of governance for the islands, giving them more autonomy. And Joe Grimond actually brought down representatives from Faroes and from the Isle of Man to explain to the councils and to the people here that that wasn't a good idea, that there were problems with that, however attractive it might seem. But here we are in 2024, and we're in exactly the same place. 50 years later, where we're still talking about new models of governance, new models of autonomy for the islands. The third man I want to mention is Armand Hammer. Armand Hammer, a deal maker extraordinaire. I mean, this was the absolutely classic deal maker, and single-handedly he brought oil to Orkney. It was his decision. He was a hands-on maverick leader of an oil company, and it was his decision that the oil from Piper and Claymore would come to Flotta and develop Flotta. He could have joined the Forties pipeline group to take the oil down to the mainland, but he didn't like them, and they didn't like him. And he said, no, I'm going to Flotta, and created the Flotta terminal. Very much the last of the oil moguls, and an extraordinary character. He was born in 1898. He trained as a doctor. He was a qualified doctor, medical man, but he never practiced. He went to Moscow in 1920. His family had roots in Odessa in Ukraine, now Ukraine. And in 22, he was signing trade deals with Lenin. And then he knew Stalin, he knew all the subsequent leaders of the Soviet Union. And extraordinarily, he provided this link between the US, right the way through the Cold War, between the USA and Russia. And the little picture at the bottom there is of his friend, Leonid Brezhnev, who was General Secretary of the USSR Communist Party in the 60s, 70s. And Brezhnev actually gave him a house in Moscow to stay. So he had this extraordinary ability to create deals and to work across lines. He didn't get into oil till he was 58 years old. He bought Occidental, which was then a nearly bankrupt little California company, which then had a value, I think, of $34,000 as a tax shelter. He was told that if he drilled dry wells, he could write it off against tax, and it was going to save his tax bill. But then they struck oil, and he bought that in 1958. By 1968, largely because he had very big concession in Libya, then he was rivaling the Big Seven as the eighth of the oil sisters, to be a very big company indeed. He fell out with his partners because he reached a deal with Libya to stop them nationalizing the oil when Gaddafi came into power, by giving them a 40-cent increase in their take, which broke the consensus amongst the big oil companies that they were going to hold the line. And in doing that, he incurred their displeasure, and he remained very much an independent man with his own mind, as he did when he was in Flotta. Rather a forgotten figure, I think. I drew out two biographies from the library. Joe Grimmon's, which has been in regular withdrawal since it was published in the early 90s, perhaps a bit earlier than that. And I drew out Armand Hammer's biography, which hadn't been taken out since 1991. But a big character. He made himself very popular with the council. He was liked. He was an affable man. I negotiated with him once, and he was a very humorous, affable character to meet. But my goodness, he must have been tough as old boots. But so he's the man who brought oil to Flotta. He formed Oxy, the company which operates Flotta, with Paul Getty and Lord Thompson as his two partners. So it was a partnership. Very quickly, just some idea of the speed of change. The fact that Flotta was ahead at this point. Flotta got planning consent in January 74 in advance of the acts which later came along, and was delivering fuel by 76, December 76. Zetland had a lot more problems. They had a far more complicated situation, which I'll come to in a moment. So it was this speed of change, which affected us as well as a company. You know, we were told, never mind the cost, just get it done. And when we first came to Shetland, we bid for the contract at Sunborough. I think it was £7 million at the time, which is probably, I don't know, £35 million today. Everything else was negotiated. And we ended up with a contract worth 32 million, probably 150, 160 million pounds by today's standards. But it was just get it done. The panic to solve the country's energy problem and to get North Sea oil flowing was considerable. There's the numbers, some of the numbers, I've sort of highlighted those Sunborough Airport numbers just as a sign of the activity that was going on. The airport was designed for 1 million and 60,000 ATMs, and it very nearly reached it, but then didn't quite achieve its initial intent because things started to drop off. The oil companies decided to go elsewhere in Shetland and to run from Aberdeen. And today, Sunborough, it's sad to see it because it's just a couple of Loganaires parked on a huge parking area, whereas before it was just packed solid and active 24 hours a day. Then, so what happened when the news that oil was going to come? And I've talked about Ian Clark and his idea of a provisional order, which then later became these two acts. There was the Zetland County Council Act of April 1974 and the Orkney one of July 74. They're almost identical, not quite identical, but they're almost identical. But in developing this legislation, it was Shetland that took the lead because their problem was greater. And caused them more problems and delays than it did for Orkney. But there are three big Orkney names there, George Marwick and Duncan Robertson in particular, who then had to pick up these duties to run the harbour of Kirkwall and Scapa Flow, whereas in Shetland it was the entire territorial sea that was covered. So it was this triumvirate of the Shetland Council, Westminster with Joe Grimmond, and the Orkney Council working to form some kind of front against what the oil companies, the worst the oil companies might have done. But there were big differences between the islands, very much on the basis of what we just talked about with Arm and Hammer. Hammer came along and he bought the land on Flotta in 1973 in direct negotiation with the islanders. The compulsory purchase part of the Act, which we'll come to in a moment, wasn't necessary to buy the land for the terminal. And he got planning permission in January 74. So things were well away. So you had this fast-thinking maverick leader in Occidental who made things happen and established relationships directly. The council knew if they wanted a decision, he was the man who would do it. Shetland, on the other hand, was juggling a whole consortium of companies, much more corporate companies, the lawyers, the accountants, the planners, who were trying to assert the rights of the oil companies in what they did. And they also had to deal with a lot of land speculation, because straight from 1972, speculators and a company called Nordport in particular had moved into Shetland, buying up land in anticipation of then using it for an oil terminal. They had that to deal with, and their objections to the Zetland County Council Act ran right the way through to the last minute. They were only withdrawn absolutely at the last minute. So there were complex joint ventures and a lot of companies all vying for their part of what was going to happen in Shetland. But the islands knew, and so did the oil companies, that they really wanted to go there. You know, time and time again, the argument was used by the councils, we don't need you. If you want to come, you come on our terms. If you don't want to come, that's fine. We're okay. We have an economy which works. We have a traditional economy that works. We really don't need you to come. And the oil companies saying, well, we're going to go away if you insist on this. And the councils were okay, go. And so they were in quite a strong, or they took quite a strong negotiating position. But the companies did need to go there. They didn't want to have to go south directly into the mainland. Just making a point here, I'm not going to read all this, that the two acts, the Zetland County Council Act, the Orkney County Council Act, are harbour acts. They gave harbour powers, which then enabled everything else. I'll come back to that later. So Joe Grimmon's argument in Parliament for these two acts to go through, he argued that the islands are special, that they do, I'm going to have to put my glasses on here to see it there, that the situation's special and it's a unique impact on a community that needs to be carefully controlled. And then the thinking was this was going to last for maybe 30 years, maybe 40 years, and that then the companies would disappear, the oil money would go. What was going to happen after that? There was a reason to protect. And then his more detailed argument are largely those of well-being, environment, tradition, preservation, and fair shares, and control of the way the industry was introduced. But also, most importantly, is the retention in the islands of a fair share of the oil revenues. That the oil just shouldn't be allowed to come without some spin-off to, in financial terms, to deal with direct problems of the environment and later problems in investment into industries and protecting traditional industries. So that was his reasoning on wider control. The companies needed this, and this is in his Hansard speech of April 73, if you want to read the more substantive case that he made around that. But he also acknowledged that it was inevitable that the oil companies were going to go there, whatever they thought, that it was seen by some as a threat to a distinctive way of life, but that they couldn't stop it, even if they wanted to, that it was going to happen. So they needed to get the best deal they could. And then when it came out, the various powers, principally the harbour authorities, the powers as harbour authorities, the special compulsory purchase powers, which allowed the councils to say to the oil companies, you will go here. This is where you will put your terminal. And in Shetland in particular, you'll work together. You know, in the early days, there was talk of individual terminals for individual companies. And they said, no, you're going together, you're going to solemn vote. But they lapsed. They were temporary powers. So the acts are still in place, of course, as harbour authorities, but those special compulsory powers lapsed. in 1978 and 1982. What the powers are, then the financial powers. So what the powers enable the council to do was to negotiate with the oil companies to get a share of the revenue. So they're using the powers they had as a negotiating tool. They were able to persuade the companies to pay a royalty on the oil coming ashore, to pay disturbance agreements, and to sign contracts to use the harbour facilities which the councils were able to own. There is a comparison with Alaska and Valdez, which was going on at the same time. Valdez got a better financial deal from the companies, but they got a less beneficial environmental and control deal. So the argument is that you remember the Esso Valdez disaster in Alaska, that couldn't happen in Shetland or Orkney because there was greater control from the harbour's authorities. Although Shetland did have a spill very soon after oil started flowing, when the Benicia hit one of the mooring dolphins and fractured one of its tanks, arguably because there was insufficient tugs available to maneuver them in. But that, in actual fact, sharpened up the environmental control. And so the environmental management after that has been as successful as it could be. Of course, there have been changes, but successful as it could be. Getting that through Parliament, there were quite a lot of parliamentary shenanigans. The provisional order, which was originally put forward in 1972, would have gone through on the knot, except there was, I made a mistake with this slide. I called it the Shetland Democratic Movement, which is a bad mistake because it's the Shetland Democratic Group. There is a Shetland movement now, which is arguing for more independence or autonomy. But the Shetland Democratic Group was a group of councillors, right-wing councillors, who argued against the council having any control. They argued in favour of the free market. They were fairly, through their contacts with the Conservative Party, they got to Edward Heath. And the decision was made that the provisional order would have to be a private bill. It would have to go through before Parliament as a private bill. That probably made it a better deal, actually. But that was going through, and then Tam Dalyell, who was a Labour MP, if you know about private bills, but you only have one MP who can shout object, and it fails. It has to find more time for debate, and usually there's no more time for debate. And Tam Dalyell shouted object, and the bill had to go to public inquiry, which again actually tightened up the act, made it a better act. But there was a lot of in and out of clauses and argument and argy-bargy before it eventually went through. It was almost ready to go through, and had he called the January 1974 election, which would have meant that the bill fell, but it was passed in Parliament that it should carry over the election. And it went back through, but it still had to go through the Lords. And at the very last minute, Nordport withdrew their objection, and it went through and became law in April 1974. And the other argument from a lot of MPs was a point of principle, that the councils didn't have the capacity to handle this kind of money and in this kind of relationship with the oil companies. And what about the precedents? If Orkney and Shetland get it, the whole country will want it. But in actual fact, it stayed just with Orkney and Shetland. It remains a unique set of local government powers, which are still on the statute book. And again, very quickly, I'm certainly not going to read all this, but what the reserve funds do, which we now have, is what the Acts gave to the councils was the ability to develop what we might call a sovereign wealth fund, sovereign with inverted commas, in the same way Norway has in a huge, huge different way. But it didn't actually guarantee money to the councils. It gave them the powers to negotiate with the oil companies. So the Acts give them a right to spend the money, but it didn't get a right to receive it. That had to be negotiated directly with the councils. And one of the key clauses, which is covered by the arrow, is that they managed to get a clause in which could said the council could use the money for any other purpose, which in the opinion of the council is solely in the interests of the county or its inhabitants, which is a pretty wide-ranging clause. But the money that goes into the reserve funds has to come from harbour surpluses. So it's a Harbours Act. These acts are about harbours and harbour activities. And the money that goes into the reserve comes from the harbour funds. And it gives the councils the right to transfer, either use it in the council account, which case it would affect their grant from central government, or they can put it in the reserve fund, which is out of central government control. And today, I think the Shetland fund stands at between 400 and 500 million. And the Orkney fund, I think, is about 250 million. So they still have very substantial funds. So what did the arrival of all these outside companies, all this incredible activity, which, I have to say, I found incredibly exciting as a young engineer. But of course, the impacts were becoming known, they were becoming huge. And there was a lot of hyperbole in the press. This is a Daily Express headline. Treasure Island. This is when they came to Flotta. Everyone was going to be rich. And didn't quite work out like that. And then it spawned a few art ventures. And some of you will know of the play, the Cheviot, the Stag, and the Black Oil, which is part of my title. And that concerned itself with the way in which Scotland's natural resources have been misused over the years. So the Cheviots, the sheep, stag, the hunting estates, and the black oil, the oil resources. And there are a couple of this film Local Hero, which most of you will know perhaps, loosely based on Flotta, very loosely based on Flotta. I think Mr. Happer from the film, who was head of Knox Oil, is a nicer character than Arm & Hammer, actually. Arm & Hammer was a bit of a vain man, I think. He loved his high-level contacts. He always said Flotta was his favourite venture because it put him in touch with the British royal family. That he met the Queen and he met Prince Charles and others in the royal family. A vain man, I think, but nonetheless an impressive deal maker. And the story in Local Hero of a local community who are all going to be rich because the oil company turns up, and it doesn't quite work out that way. The other one, which I recommend to you, if you can get a hold of a copy, I don't think it's still in publication, is Willock and the Black Oil. This concerns itself more with actually what happened on Flotta. The author David Sinclair was postmaster on Flotta, and there was a lot of tension between the oil company
Thanks, everybody. Apologies for the interruption. Um, thanks for the sound. So what we're going to do is, because it's lunch after this, we're able to just finish off the presentation and take the questions. I realise some people might be drifting off to talk somewhere else, so if you do, just kind of leave a bit quietly. So sorry about that, Tim.
It's all right.
We'll just pick up.
Okay, thank you, everyone. And I understand some of you might have to leave just to go to other events, so I won't take it personally if I see you walking out the door. So very quickly, we've just got a few slides left. Willock and the black oil. Do get hold of this if you can. It'll be in the library. It has a foreword by Howie Firth. Who's he? But Howie was deeply involved in all of this as a broadcaster and writer. David Sinclair, who was the postmaster on Flotta, there was exasperation on Flotta at the condition of the roads, the use of the pier. There were disputes over islanders being able to get their goods in and out, and the contractors working and the mud and the rock and everything else. So there was a lot of disturbance for the islanders. And David's book, he decided to not do it through complaints, but to do it through humor. And he wrote a series of articles for the Orcadian about Willock and Pearly Braes. And Willock, in this little event here, which I put the quote, and I won't attempt to read it out in Orcadian, but it's about the disturbance payment. The first disturbance payment came through for £500,000, and not a penny of it was spent in Flotta. And there was a lot of outrage about that on the island. So there was dispute, perhaps more between the islanders and the council than there was between the islanders and the workers, who they got on with pretty well, I think. But it's a good social, political, economic history, that book. And it's very, very funny. So I do recommend it too if you get the chance. And there it is. It's all over. Pretty much for me and my family. We were on our way back to Dubai in 1979. And in that short period of time, in 5 years, the whole setup had been done. The oil had been brought ashore, the terminals had been built, the oil was flowing. So for all the upsets and difficulties and the legal changes, it had gone through in an incredibly short period of time. I'm just thinking of what HS2 is taking today. It's taken 30 years, and we still don't have it. So the speed with which it happened was extraordinary. It wasn't quite an end for me and my family, because we still have a house in Shetland. We stayed there all these 50 years, and this is our house there. And sometimes I look out across Spicky Loch there and out towards Fula, just to the right. And I think, has anything changed? I think there have been 2 houses built on the other side of the loch in 50 years. So in terms of that view, nothing has changed. But then I think again, and even in this view, what's changed is land tenure. When we came here 50 years ago, it was a network of crops. Now it's essentially 2 big farms. My friend Willie Mayland and Tom Burgess competed with each other to buy up the crofts to create Quendell Farm and Noss Farm, 2 big dairy farms. Although Noss has just gone back to beef only, but it was dairy. So that's a big change. And what's the legacy of the Act? Well, the Harbour Authority powers are still there, of course, but not the land's powers. So there is still that control of the council in what happens in their harbour areas. The reserve funds, investments and projects continue. There's a fair amount of money, I know, being voted through for the Island Games in Orkney. The infrastructure's changed, services support has changed, and the both new and traditional industries have been developed and are funded through some of the money that's come through from oil as we enter what Sandy was talking about, which is the big energy transition to take us across to renewables. It's not the same amount of money in renewables, and there's not the same amount of need for the islands as there was with regard to the oil. So where might the benefit come? I was watching Prime Minister's questions last Wednesday, and Alistair Carmichael made the point that the Viking wind farm was given £2 million last week not to produce. But at the same time, we have very high levels of oil poverty in Orkney and Shetland. So what about rates for electricity which come from us hosting all these wind farms and producing all this power? And there seemed to be a bit of an opening there. The Prime Minister did say, yes, he would talk to Alistair about it, and particularly with regard to the islands. So perhaps we will get some benefit in the cost of power. And then there's the new works that are coming up. Here are the new rigs of NIG. We saw the old rigs going up at the beginning of the talk when oil was being developed. These are the new rigs, which are the foundations for the offshore wind turbines and the offshore wind towers, which are now being based there. But there is a big change. These have not been made at NIG. They've been imported. Those jackets have come from China. So it's not British Steel and Scottish workers who are producing them. It's coming all the way from China. So globalization has happened, and NIG is being used merely for assembly rather than for manufacture. And I know the Scottish government would love to have more manufacture related to development of offshore wind in particular. And then the last slide is changing perspectives on devolution. I said there was a devolution theme, which has been there for 50 years. You know, Joe Grimman was talking about the wisdom of an autonomy model like Faroes, or last year we even had James, perhaps advisedly, dare I say that, talking about Norway, and the press picked up on Norway and nothing else. But of course, it's more than that. It's finding ways in which we can manage the islands in future. But in actual fact, the powers probably were centralized over this period rather than with more autonomy. And perhaps it's just beginning at the moment to swing back to us, away from centralization, back to something more local. We have the Islands Act, which is fine in its way, but it just really agrees to give an impact assessment of legislation concerning the islands rather than giving powers to the islands. And the same with marine planning. We've got the current programme for levelling up and the Levelling Up Fund, which is going to help work in Orkney. And from last year, we have the local, the Orkney initiative to consider again the way in which the islands would like to have more autonomy and have more powers given to the islands as opposed to being held in Westminster or Holyrood. Holyrood never very popular with the islands. I remember in that 1978 devolution, the phrase going round that because they were very much against devolution here in the islands, with the phrase that in Westminster they don't care about us, but in Holyrood they really don't like us. So better with the people who don't like us rather than the people who don't like us. And that is it. Thank you very much indeed.
Well, thank you, and thanks for putting up with the disturbance there. So we do have as I say, you're rolling on into lunch, so we've got a bit of time here we do have a bit of time to ask some questions. So got a question right at the back, Gareth. We're gonna very fit young gentleman with a microphone that's gonna have to run around.
Tim, thank you very much. Since you volunteered for this, I've really been looking forward to the opportunity to come and listen to that history, and it was everything that I hoped. So thank you, first of all, for that. It was brilliant. One of the things you haven't really touched on so much was the technical work that you did, and I mean, it was fascinating what you talked about. But I just wondered how the works, were done. You were an engineer, that was your role. What kind of activities were involved in actually building the piers, and were there any local resources or characters involved in that enterprise?
There were absolutely local resources and characters in our workforce, which was a mixture of people from the islands and quite a lot of people from the shipyards in Glasgow, and welders and platers, people like that who came up and stayed in the labour camps. The actual techniques, we learned quite a lot, particularly here in Flotta. Someone was talking to me in the break there. We ran into a bit of trouble at Flotta in building that crude jetty, which was a big jetty. And the Flotta coast is quite exposed. It's got a very long fetch over from the northeast, and there were some horrendous storms in the winter of 75, 76, which put us a long way behind program. At the same time, Oxy were wanting us to speed up. And that's how I ended up negotiating with Arm & Hammer, who was a very, very wise man. He wanted the end result. And they agreed to fund the Gem 126, which was an 8-leg jack-up platform, in return for concessions from us with regard to the timing and getting the project finished in advance of the time rather than being late. And that enabled us to plonk the piles in. And it became a much more straightforward operation. But it was a big operation. There were big piles, over a metre in diameter, in 30, 35 metres of water, rock drilled into the seabed. So it was an interesting job to do. As far as the airport at Sunborough was concerned, we extended out into the sea in both ends. So it was the marine works that were the real challenge, because that runway in Shetland, the 0927, starts in the Atlantic and finishes in the North Sea. And we extended out in the sea in both directions. So it was the armouring technology to protect against the seas there, which was the key element of it, I guess. The onshore works, fairly straightforward. I mean, building runways, resurfacing runways, new lighting, new air traffic control methods, that sort of thing on the technical side. So we were reliant on our Shetland labour and our Orkney labour, mainly for the non-technical tasks, but we had a lot of technical people in who were both doing the work and training up people in the islands to take the work on in the future.
Thank you. So we've got on the left, and then Simon. Yeah.
I was just going to say, obviously, thank you for the talk. But you obviously worked in Dubai, and then you settled in the Shetlands. One was very warm, and perhaps one was very cold. Perhaps you'll tell us why you fell in love with the Shetlands.
Well, one was too hot, one was too cold, I guess. Sorry, what was the question in the end?
I suppose what made you go back to the Shetlands and live there?
Fell in love with the islands as soon as we arrived. As soon as we got off the plane in '74. My wife particularly fell in love with the islands. And I don't know if she passed on, but I don't know if she ever forgave me for leaving Shetland. I think she'd have had me working the Shetland Islands Council. But I was young and ambitious and keen to get on projects around the world, which we did. But no, we just love the islands, and my family love the islands. My eldest granddaughter's up there at the moment, and the family has spent the summer there. And it's become home, really, over 50 years. Does that make me a Shetlander? 50 years? It doesn't, you know. I'm still an outsider. But I could be an honorary one.
Yeah, I see. Yeah.
Thank you, Tim. That's fascinating. From what you said, I can see why the island councils were in a very strong position with respect to the oil companies, but not so much they were in strong position with Parliament, because Parliament surely could just have said, no, we'll have the oil anyway, thanks. So I'm wondering, unless I'm wrong, what was persuasive to Parliament, and does that have any lessons for us today?
It's a very good question, Simon. I don't altogether know the answer as what persuaded the majority of the MPs in Westminster to push this through. There was certainly a great deal of worry about the energy situation, that nothing should happen to interrupt the development of the fields and getting the oil ashore. There was a panic for that. I think there was a genuine appreciation of what it would mean to islands like Orkney and Shetland to have this development suddenly thrust upon them, and the need to prevent the companies just running roughshod over the islands. The behavior of the speculators in Shetland in particular, I think, had caused worry. The company Nordport, which had started buying land, very much supported by a group of Edinburgh merchant banks and merchant banks and lawyers. There seemed to be a David and Goliath battle building there. So was that sympathy. And I think respect for Joe Grimmett in particular and the case he put forward. And the later Chancellor of the Exchequer, Norman Lamont, who is now Lord Lamont of Lerwick, has Shetland roots and Shetland background. So he made a strong case on the Conservative benches. On the Labour Liberal Dem side, there was the Lab-Lib Pact, which enabled the final push to go through, in that Labour needed the support of the Liberals to govern. And Joe Grimmett was able to the Liberals say, well, you know, you see us through this and we'll give you support. So that became another negotiating tick. But there were objectors, you know, certainly, on the Conservative side especially. I don't know that they could make the same case again. You know, the idea of the islands was special. We're still special, of course, very special, but not quite as special as we were in 1974. It's as different as we were in 1974.
Okay. So, another
Hi.
question?
I was just wondering, you were talking about the airfields in Shetland and how they were working 24/7 at those times. Was the option for night flights and night landings extended to the inter-island flights for civilians, if you like, as it's only fairly recently happened in the inter-island flights in Orkney that they've had night landing capabilities on a scheduled basis?
Yeah, at the start, you know, I mean, the landing situation in Sombra, which is little more than a strip, really, up to 1970, up to 1970. So the instrument and landing facilities were very, very basic at the start. I guess the helicopters had an easier time of it, but it's only over the years that it's become much more capable of instrument and night landings. There's always activity at the airport, 24/7, but landings and takeoffs much more limited to daylight hours and reasonable conditions. But it was incredibly hectic. It's, we were trying to build an airport and the place was just so busy that we did a lot of our work at night when things are a bit quieter.
Okay, I've got time for one more question. If anybody's got one last question over on my right.
Thanks for that. That was really, really fascinating. There's no surprise, I'm sure. You mentioned about the different sort of governing models once the benefits started coming from the islands, and you mentioned that the money that each island local authority had was, well, Shetland had basically twice as much. And I just wondered if you had any thoughts or insights around whether the impact was to do with the different governing arrangements around the opportunity, or whether it's just directly related to the size of the oil opportunity. So, has Shetland managed to kind of make a little bit more out of the opportunity than Shetland? I don't know if you have any comments around that.
Well, they have more money. It'd be a controversial thing to say, but I'll say it. I think Orkney spent its money a bit better than Shetland has at times. Shetland ran into a few audit problems with the way it was using its funds. But the whole Shetland operation was much, much bigger. I mean, Solomvo is huge compared to Flotta. So they have more money going in, and they have spent it on some very obvious infrastructure. The road network, which was extremely basic, has been completely rebuilt using oil money, some oil money. The swimming pools and the village halls and the primary schools and the marinas have all been developed as infrastructure for the local community. And some of the money went into social services, I believe. And they ran into a few audit problems with that. And some of the investments in industry didn't work out. But nonetheless, the fear expressed in Parliament that the councils couldn't manage it has been proved to be wrong. That overall the acts have worked and the reserve funds have worked and the councils have managed the transition to that oil economy. And they're now trying to manage the transition to renewables, which gives different problems.
Thank you. And I think that's a great moment to draw a conclusion to the presentation, and hopefully you'll go away and think about the relevance of what you had today, as we move forward into the next energy transition. But I just want to say thanks again to Tim, and if everybody can express your thanks, and I'll transfer down.